Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Ace on Music. I'm joined as always by Sean and Mark. So, over the pandemic, I know that I've spent a great deal of time sitting in my garden listening to music and re-listening to music, as we've discussed on the show several times. And it occurred to me that something that might be kind of fun to talk about is that anytime that you get really into a band and really start exploring their catalog and learning the albums and things like that, invariably, of course, as you know, bands are made up of human beings and human beings are imperfect, they're going to occasionally make records that don't really connect with you. But today I want to talk about more about those records that you feel are hidden gems in the catalog. The album that maybe came out after during a period in the band's career when maybe their music wasn't in vogue, so it didn't get the kind of attention that it should have, or maybe it was that style of music was, kind of being poo-pooed by the general population at the time. But it really is an exceptional record that stands out among the catalog, but just never got the attention that it deserved. So I thought it might be kind of fun if we talked about those. And I thought I'd kick it off with one of my all-time favorite bands, which is a band from the 70s that first hit it big with things like Don't Fear the Reaper and songs like that, and that's Blue Oyster Cult. Arguably, they in the 80s was when they were at the height of their fame. Maybe the 70s, you could argue, but whether it was the era of not Turn of a Friendly Card, that's Alan Parsons Project. I'm talking about Agents of Fortune, or when things like the Don't Fear the Reaper came out, or in the 80s when they did Fire of Unknown Origin and Extraterrestrial Live and those monumental records. But for me, one of the best Blue Oyster Cult albums actually came after that era, and it was the first album that came out after the Extraterrestrial Live album. Was called Revolution by Night. Now, this was sort of at a time when metal was being overlooked by the general population, and Blue Oyster Cult was now kind of being shoved into the dustbin of history as kind of having done their thing. And then this album came out, and it was a really amazing record. If you haven't had the opportunity to check it out, I highly recommend it. I mean, they got Bruce Fairbairn to do the producing, big name producer, did all kinds of bands. Look him up if you don't know who he is. And I mean, he did Slippery When Wet for Bon Jovi. He did Aerosmith stuff and everything. But there's some really really great tracks on that album, and the whole thing sounds great. I mean, they wrote one of the songs with Patti Smythe, and anyway, it's one that I go to still to this day, 30 plus odd years later, and I listen to it quite often. It's still one of my faves. So there's an example of what I'm trying to get at today. So, is there any records that jump into your mind that fall into that category?
Well, for me, overlooked albums are like my favorite albums. I like to go against the mainstream a lot.
Okay, give me
So,
an example.
well, like, I don't know, let's say out of the blue, U2's Zoropia.
Okay,
Uh, I love that album. It's got a great sound. Like, I mean, I was a U2 fan, on their early days, but when they were transitioning with Brian Eno, a very underrated album. It's a very good album.
well,
You know,
they came off of arguably the biggest era that they had just had. The Joshua Tree and all of that made the massive impact they did with that.
yeah,
And then they come out with with this record, and
yeah.
it was quite a bit different.
Well, it was, but I definitely like the category here is overlooked records. I believe, like if any U2 fan out there probably dismisses this album the most, and if you go back and listen to it, you can kind of rediscover what they were going forward and what they were doing. And obviously, after that, their music has changed a lot. But
Any particular standout tracks for you on that record?
oh, you put me on the spot again.
Okay, no problem. Well,
I guess the main title, remember they were going through those videos, Zoo TV and all that
I do.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. But very, very
And didn't the
interesting.
Pop Mart tour come out of that?
I think no,
Or was that later?
It was a couple years later after that, a couple albums later. But yeah, that and I think Queen's Made in Heaven album, their last album with Freddie Mercury was put together by the remaining members. But it was like when Freddie Mercury was on his last days, he really wanted to get as much music out as possible.
Hmm.
So I think that album for Queen fans got dismissed a lot too and very overlooked. Like if you go back and listen to the album, it's a great, album, a great Freddie Mercury Queen album. You
Well,
know,
back in 2003, when Adam and I first started Siren, the first band that we ever signed to management was Asia.
mm.
If you remember them,
Oh yeah, of
the
course.
super group from the early 80s, heat of the moment and all that stuff.
Right.
And so, as a result of my affiliation with the band, and also because I was a fan even before I managed them, I became very intimate with the deep recesses of their catalog over the years. You really get into it,
Hmm.
and as big as that initial record was and impactful and everything, it really is only one chapter in a really rich musical book that these guys have written. I know that when the second record came out, Alpha, it didn't quite make the impact that the first one had. You had a lot of personnel problems, and I think at one point John Wetton, the singer, left the band, and he was replaced by Greg Lake. I remember there was a very famous MTV show they did in Japan where Greg Lake was suddenly singing, and but that record had some of the best Asia songs they ever wrote on that thing. And then, of course, moving on further after they made the transition to having John Payne to be the singer, there was some amazing records that came out of that era. I mean, right out the bat, they did the Aqua album, which has some really great records, but the Aria album is the one that really. Now, this is an album that most people would never have heard.
Hmm.
This is an album that I couldn't imagine it having sold more than maybe 20 or 30,000 copies in the world. But every song is strong, and John Payne's in there. He has a strong vocal style. He and John or Jeff Downes wrote pretty much all the material on it, and there's just great song. It's just great song after great song, and
Still making cool album covers at the time, right?
yeah, in fact, both of those album covers were done by the illustrious Roger Dean.
Yeah,
So
right.
it's and related to Asia, before earlier in his career, Jeff Downes, who's a keyboard player in Asia, he also was the keyboard player in a band called the Buggles. Now, the Buggles are probably considered by most to be a one-hit wonder. They had a massive single that became an iconic song because it was the very first video ever played on MTV. When they debuted, this was the first video that came out the gate, and it was called Video Killed the Radio Star.
All right.
Big song. But what most people probably know that song, but they don't know the Buggles came out with a second record after that initial one, which was called Age of Plastic, the album that had Video Killed the Radio Star. They came out with a second record called Adventures in Modern Recording. Excuse me. And there was at least one single on there, which I think was tragically overlooked, and it's called "I Am a Camera." And if you want to hear that brand of quirky '80s pop, it's a perfect example. I mean, you have Trevor Horn, who is the mastermind behind the Buggles, went on to produce so many big bands. Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Seal. So yeah, I own that suit. It's unfortunately the elements have not been kind to it. There's something about the glue they used or whatever to get that silver effect on the jacket, so it's not in the greatest shape. But hey, it's a piece of rock and roll
Yeah,
history.
that's cool. I
So
wish I had it.
what's another one on your list?
Well, Deep Purple Burn. I mean, I'm a drummer, so
All right.
that to me that album was a very under. Because people were expecting another Smoke on the Water type album. So when that album came out, there was a lot of people disappointed in that album.
Yeah,
You know?
it's gone on to become a pretty big one in their catalog.
Yeah, but it was definitely overlooked for that period of time, for a long time, and then it kind of resurfaced again as a great album. But and Thin Lizzy's Thunder and Lightning was a very underlooked album, I believe.
Yeah, I mean that's definitely one in the catalog when they had sort of fallen out of favor at the time and
Yeah,
close to the end there. But
and ELO's Zoom, that was an underrated album. That's when Jeff Lynne finally came back with ELO, and
I remember.
I think that's a great album. I think it's very overlooked, as a piece of music history. But
Well, one of the ones that really stands out for me, and I'm not sure if you're aware of this album, but you're aware of the band Cheap Trick. I
Uh-huh.
mean, this is a band that continues to embrace the philosophy that making new records is an important part of them being a band. I know a lot in today's day and age and the way that music works, a lot of especially heritage acts don't really embrace the idea of making new music as much as they did in the past. But Cheap Trick certainly has an illustrious career. They have a catalog of hits that any band could dream of. But one of my favorite albums from them came out in the late 90s, and it was simply called Cheap Trick. And it had a really black and white cover on it that showed a bunch of their instruments piled up or something like that. And I know that there's one song on there in particular called Hard to Tell, which is one of my all-time favorite Cheap Trick tracks. I mean, that song is just monumental, and I dream of the one of my one of my most jealous moments is Ricky Warwick, the singer from Black Star Riders and Thin Lizzy. He's as big a Cheap Trick fan as I am, and he had the opportunity a number of years ago to tour with them, opening for them on a number of dates, and he befriended them as he does. And the thing about Cheap Trick is they pride themselves on keeping up on their entire catalog so that they can play anything that they've recorded on any night that they want.
I heard that. I heard a lot of people test their boundaries too.
Well, yeah. And what they've done on a number of occasions is for people who are very special to them is like I know it's happened to Ricky and it's happened to Eddie Trunk. Those are the two people I know personally who have had this where they went to them and said, "Okay, we're playing tonight. You know, it's 60-minute set or whatever. You pick the set list. Anything from Cheap Trick." And Ricky also loves this 97 Cheap Trick self-titled album as much as I do, and he put Hard to Tell in the set list that night. I would have loved to see that. I would love to have seen that. Never got the chance.
And they pulled it off.
Yeah, they absolutely did.
Wow.
They absolutely did. So
That's when you know you've been playing too long as a band. When you can play anything on your catalog without on a whim, right?
yeah, well, you know, and I'll add as a minor footnote to the Cheap Trick story is that I remember in the '90s. This is I think before the self-titled one. They came out with an album which most people would never have heard. It's called "Woke Up with a Monster."
I remember that.
And I
With
saw
the clown on the cover.
that's right, hiding under the bed.
yeah.
Yeah, and I saw them play live on that tour. They were opening for Meatloaf, who was touring the Bat Out of Hell 2 album at the time. And they played several songs from that album. And I remember that live show is what caused me to run out and buy that record and check it out because the title track especially was very hooky and very catchy, and I really enjoyed it. But again, Woke Up with a Monster, another great Cheap Trick album. If you are a Cheap Trick fan, it's worth your time and attention. So,
What about Mark? Mark, where are you? What do you think is a very overlooked album?
Well, you know, it's interesting, Sean, when you mentioned the U2 album because I remember hearing Bono speak at one point, and he talked about how a band can easily, even a band like U2, overwhelm its audience with material, and that the most important thing to do is take breaks so that didn't happen because audiences local get tired of you performing no matter who you are, just like album releases. People only have so much money.
Right.
And it struck me, I think, that's why they would always do it in pairs or in triplets, but never. They would always take a break. But my favorite underrated albums, I think history has proven were not necessarily underrated. They may not have been huge commercial successes, but would be things like The Wild, the Innocent, and the E Street Shuffle by Springsteen, which followed Greetings in Asbury Park at a time where the audience didn't really know what to make of him yet. And yet out comes, two wildly interesting albums, just like Street Life Serenade with Billy Joel early on, producing some incredible pieces of music, but at a point in his career in which, things were still kind of developing. And I think that there's a lot of that. So I don't know that they're underrated as much as the public was unaware of that artist. And but I do always get back to one of the most disastrous first releases of all time, which and Ace. I mean, I don't know if you know the story, but when Billy Joel first came out with Cold Spring Harbor, the album was produced at the wrong pitch, and
I've
it created tremendous depression. But if you actually listen to the record, the songs, one after another, are masterpieces. But the song itself, being released, it was at the wrong pitch. They never fixed it because who is this guy? This unknown, Joel character. But talk about an album that started out as a disaster, and I think has shown itself to be an iconically incredible album over time.
Yeah, and to pick up on what you just said there, a lot of the albums that are on my list are the result of established acts who went in a direction of experimentation with their own sound. And most people are not willing to give a band the room in order to do that. They know, what they want out of a particular brand, and when they don't get it, they're not happy.
Right.
So I look, for example, one of my favorite records from the entire formidable Yes catalog is one called Talk. Now, this was after Steve Howe had left the band. We have Trevor Rabin, he's doing the guitars now, but you have John Anderson on vocals, and they came out with this record, which is a monumental record for me. But because the general population of fans, they're very divided. It's a very Van Halen kind of thing, where there's people who believe in the Sammy Hagar version, and people like David Lee Roth. There's also people who only gravitate towards the Steve Howe version of Yes as opposed to Trevor Rabin. Even though the one thing I say to those people when they threw that in my face is that the Trevor Rabin era was actually much more successful with songs like Owner of a Lonely Heart and all that kind of thing than anything Yes did previously. But that being said, the Talk album certainly didn't have singles on it or anything like that, but an album that to this day I still listen to on a regular basis. It's just tremendous. And in fact, when I saw them perform it live at the Gorge in Washington State, it was one of the best live shows I'd ever seen. Just an amazing, amazing thing. Another example of that, in a little bit different way, and it's one that's a little closer to you and I, Sean, is, for those of you who don't know, of course, there's the band Black Sabbath. Was originally fronted by Ozzy Osbourne. He had his problems, and at one point he was replaced by the formidable Ronnie James Dio. And they did some amazing records with Ronnie back in the 80s. I mean, you got Heaven and Hell, you got Mob Rules, and, But many years later, we were associated with when the guys decided to basically reform Sabbath, the Dio era of Sabbath. But they didn't want to call it Black Sabbath at that point, so they came up with this name Heaven and Hell. But there was always a certain magic between Geezer Butler, Tony Iommi, and Ronnie Dio when they would write music. And they came out with one studio record under this new moniker, and it was called, it was called The Devil You Know. And it's an album that, obviously, because most people aren't going to run out and hear about this, 20, 30 years on, Sabbath, supposed Pretender Sabbath album, it really was an amazing record. If you haven't given it a chance, there's some really great music writing. I mean, Iommi does some incredible guitar work on it. Ronnie's vocal delivery is unbelievable, and the songs are really good. There's a real capturing of that incredible energy that those three songwriters have together, and it's an album well worth your attention.
Definitely overlooked.
Yes.
As we get older, I think a lot of the overlooked albums, I guess it's like a maturity level. We start, listening to stuff that we haven't listened to before. And I think when you think of overlooked albums, I think it's, like bands, like artists like Devo and David Bowie and all of that. Everyone's got an overlooked album, And I think as we mature, I think we accept those more. It's like, and now we're coming to an age where I think everything's overlooked. Like, a lot of the good new artists are really overlooked. Like you just mentioned Heaven and Hell, and I think that was the kind of period where things are starting to get overlooked. It's just, if it didn't catch real quick, it just kind of...
Well, you and I have had this conversation in private many times, but the fact is there's just such a volume of new material coming out that you're gonna miss stuff. But
Right.
But going back to, when there's a major shift in the ideas within a band that really becomes divisive among the fans, a good example of that is a really, really awesome Swedish metal band called Opeth.
Mm.
Now, Opeth are heralded as being one of the great masters of melodic death metal that are going right now. They've got several iconic albums that are really held up as banners of the new era of metal. But Michael Ackerfeld, who's the main songwriter and lead singer in that band, he refuses to be bound by labels or by genres. Like the way he put it to me one night, he says, "You can't expect a great chef to cook the same type of food every night. Sometimes you feel like a salad, and sometimes you feel like a steak."
Right.
So they got together with Steve Wilson, who's a very famous prog producer, and Michael's a big fan of prog music in his listening life. And they came out with this record. They came out with two records at basically the same time. One was called Deliverance, and one was called Damnation. Deliverance was very much the traditional Opeth death metal record, and Damnation was basically an acoustic album, and it had some of the most memorable songs, and it also really allowed Mike to explore his vocal possibilities instead of having to do the Cookie Monster grinding vocals all the time. He really has a beautiful melodic voice if he decides to employ it. And I remember Adam and I, we worked with them during this era and basically oversaw all of their U.S. tours at the time. And we were on the tour where they were playing these songs from these two records. And there's one song in particular on the Damnation album called In My Time of Need, which is just an incredible, incredible song. And I would drop whatever I was doing every night of that tour to go run out and watch them play that song every single night.
Right. It's a good song.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you got anything else on your list?
Just my basics. You know me. I like talking about Floyd and
What's underrated in the Floyd catalog?
Well, to me, there was a soundtrack they did. It was for the movie More, and the reason why I think it's overlooked is because it was just when they were kind of leaving that huge psychedelia type groove with Sid Barrett, and they were discovering, Gilmore had vocals in it, and they were learning how to arrange stuff. So it was kind of the birth of Dark Side of the Moon. So if you really go back and listen to that, you hear a lot of Dark Side of the Moon elements to it. And to me, it's just their path. The next album was, coming up, Obscured by Clouds, and then Dark Side of the Moon. So I think it's just a very overlooked album because people look at it as a soundtrack, and
Hey, I consider myself a Floyd fan, and I've never listened to it.
Yeah, it's a very overlooked album, but you definitely have patience to listen to the whole thing.
Well, I'll tell you, I have one comment here on my list that I know is going to be a conflict between the two of us, and that is that one of our mutually favorite bands is the seminal horror punk band The Misfits. One of the great bands of the American punk scene of all time, in my opinion.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
And Glenn Danzig being the lead singer and everything, he certainly brought a certain swagger. But of course, he went off on his own and went more in a metal direction later in his career. And for many years, the Misfits were kind of on hold. And then at some point after, I think it was after numerous lawsuits and such things, Jerry Only and his brother Doyle managed to get the rights to be able to perform as the Misfits. But of course, Glenn was off doing his own thing. He wasn't at all interested in working with them, especially after having battled for years in the courts. And they managed to find this young man who the story I was told is that he actually was the guy who swept the floors in the studio, and they heard, late at night he would go in and record demos and stuff when the place wasn't being used. The management let him, and they overheard him, and they thought, this guy sounds great, and they tried doing some stuff with him. Anyway, they did a couple of records with him, and those records, in my opinion, stand shoulder to shoulder with the other Misfits albums. I mean, American Psycho and Famous Monsters. Famous Monsters in particular is one of my favorites, but I know that you're not a big fan of Michael Graves and his vocals.
Well, it's not that I'm not a big fan. I don't. To me, they're two different entities. Like there's it just, to me, they're not the Misfits in the way I look at it, but I don't dismiss their work. I mean, they did that one album. I don't know if Michael was on it, but they did all covers of
Yeah.
some 50 songs.
Yeah.
Yeah. See, I thought that was a great. I mean, when I first heard Misfits, wanted to see that album with Glenn. Like they had that sound. I'm like, oh,
Sure.
I would love to hear them do covers like that. So they did that. I liked that album a lot. But yeah, I'm definitely, on the original Misfits side of this story here.
Well, another band that I worked with for many, many years was one of the seminal bands of punk and metal, and that is Motorhead. And Motorhead has had a lot of albums they put out over the years, and most of them follow a fairly contiguous kind of sound throughout all of them. But one of the albums I think that was really a standout, that really didn't get the attention it deserved, was Bastards. Now, this record, when it came out, was at kind of a low point in Motorhead's career. That kind of music wasn't really being paid attention to at the time. And I believe, initially at least, the album only came out in Germany. It was literally only released in Germany. So if you were in America and you were a Motorhead fan and you wanted to hear it, you had to buy it on import. So you're going to be paying big bucks. But there's so many fantastic songs that Lemmy wrote on there. And some of them actually ended up also being recorded on Ozzy Osbourne album, because Ozzy, he gave some of those songs to Ozzy as well. But I will tell you a little story about my copy of Bastards, because it's one of my favorite stories with Lem. I was in LA and I was to meet with him at the Rainbow Bar and Grill. We were talking about some stuff about the website. And the Rainbow wasn't open at this time during the midday, but they opened for Lem. So we were there alone in the place. And as you come into the Rainbow, there's a little booth where they can, if they're selling drink tickets or whatever, they can sell them there. And above the booth is a shelf with a CD player that's hooked up to the sound system, and there's maybe about 20 CDs. And Lemmy and I were having a drink and talking, and I happened to mention that I've been looking for a copy of Bastards, and did he know where I could find one? And he said, oh wait, I think there's one here. And he went over to the shelf and he found a copy of Bastards that he had given to the Rainbow, and he put it on the system. And we stood there at the bar, and he went as every song played, he was telling me the story behind it.
Wow, that's cool.
It was an amazing experience.
I'm sure.
And then the last song fades out, and a Backstreet Boys album or something comes on. and he kind of snapped. And he walked over to the CD player. He hit the eject button, took the Bastards thing out, put it back in the CD case, walked over to me, grabbed my hand, put it in my hand, and said, here, you take it. At least somebody who will listen to it will own it.
You still have it?
I do.
Is that album hard to get?
Now it's been re-released subsequently.
Okay.
But back then it was, in the 90s, it was not an easy one to come across. So.
Yeah, I remember the Orgasmatron album was kind of overlooked for a while, I think.
Yeah, but that one has gone on to become one of the seminal albums. I mean, Orgasmatron with, what was it, Bill, who was the producer of that one? I can't remember. It was a famous producer anyway.
Yeah.
But last ones on my list that I just wanted to bring up, again, were bands who were very established and very successful, but then they put out records that maybe were out of time or whatever, and great records as far as I'm concerned, but didn't get the attention they deserve. Let's talk about one of the great arena bands of all time, which is Def Leppard. I mean, they came off of albums like Hysteria and Pyromania and selling gajillions of records, and then in the 90s they came out with this album called Euphoria, and really didn't do much. I mean, it was.
I remember that album.
I don't even know if it had any singles come off of it, but I'll tell you, it was, in my opinion, one of my favorites. In fact, has one of my all-time favorite songs from Def Leppard on it, which is called Paper Sun, which has got Phil Collins does some of the best guitar work I think he's ever done on that song. And one of my great moments was I had interviewed. They were playing in the town where I was in BC. This was before I was in management. I was a journalist, and I got an interview with Rick Allen. And after the interview, he invited me to stay for the sound check. So I was sitting out in the arena, and it was just me and Def Leppard. And Joe came up to the microphone and he said, "What do you want to hear?" And I said, well, I'd really like to hear Paper Sun. Okay. And all of a sudden they kicked into Paper Sun, and I got to see it performed just for me.
Nice.
So,
Were they touring that album at the
yeah,
time?
yeah.
Oh, okay.
Joan Jett was opening. It was a great night.
Oh, wow.
And
I bet.
the last one that's on my list is one that I know we both love, and that is the Cult's Beyond Good and Evil album.
Oh, I love that album.
Again, an album that didn't really, it came off the tail end. They had done the Love album, they had done Sonic Temple, big hits for them. Then they did that one that I think it was just called The Cult. It had the goat on the cover, and so
Right.
didn't do very well.
Right.
Kind of failed for them, and so they'd kind of fallen by the wayside. They'd become a greatest hits band where they were playing their catalog, and then this album came out, and then that single Rise came out.
Oh, love that
what
album.
a song! I mean,
It kind of introduced a new sound for the Cult, I think.
it did.
And they kind of continue with it. If you listen to every album out there, they're really overlooked and underrated albums. They're really heavy. Like I think the last album, Hidden City, I believe it's called.
Mhm.
Same thing. It's got all the heavy elements to it.
Yeah, I mean, Billy and Ian are great songwriters, despite whatever era it is. But I think that that album in particular, if you're at all a Cult fan and you haven't given your attention to Beyond Good and Evil, do it now, because go to Spotify, listen to it. You will not be disappointed.
Right.
So, Mark, do you have any other albums that spring to mind?
Well, there are plenty of albums that spring to mind that I know are amazing. A couple of quick thoughts. The first is it's amazing how narrow all of our views are, because our perception is so limited to our fandom,
Right.
and yet nobody raised Justin Bieber's.
Oh, geez.
You can only go from what I've listened to.
That's right.
I guess
That's
there's
right.
a reason for that, Mark.
A couple of quick thoughts. One is anytime you're going to take chances, you're going to have albums that don't hit as well, because you're going to shake up your audience. Bob Dylan went to electric guitar, and the whole original fandom, fan base was confused.
Right. Just like Hendrix doing the Band of Gypsies. When all
Yeah,
that
I
stuff.
mean, you're going to throw a wrench in, and there have been very few artists to do it extremely successfully through time, and Mark Knopfler is one of them,
Yes.
who has constantly evolved, grabbing new styles, staying current, taking chances, and his fan base, of which I am one, went through it all with him. We went, even when he was playing with Chet Atkins, and he went full country, and he went in different directions. We stayed with him because he was great, and he managed to do it with a precision that is really unrivaled. But while I leave that thought with you, I wanted to mention that bands were taking some really interesting chances back in the beginning of sort of modern rock and roll. One of them were these rock operas,
Yeah.
and some of them, like Tommy, from the Who, really caught on, and others, they were harder fought, or they were thematic albums that didn't get picked up. And I think one of the greatest albums that nobody has really heard that I'm aware of is called Soap Opera from the Kinks. And it was a story. The whole album was constructed as a story about this guy who dreamed of being a rock star, but he was really a very common person in England who did nothing but file files all the time. And I think some of these chances that were taken were real works of art, and deserved more credit, because they did help establish where rock and roll went, even though most people never heard them.
Absolutely true. Absolutely true.
That is one of my favorite Kinks albums.
Well, there you go. See, but you and I are unique.
Yeah, I'm just weird. I don't know.
By definition, the two of you cannot be unique. But anyway,
But we can be unique-ish.
There we go.
But it's funny how an album like that. I mean, the Kinks album, Soap Opera, has this line about how it's not worth crying over a piece of shepherd's pie, because he thought he was, in the song, and he thought he was special. He wanted to be the king of rock and roll, and yet his wife was still a normal person making shepherd's pie. And these are lines that I use with my daughter. When she starts to get upset over something small, I'll say that, and every so often I'll play a song or something like that, because they were stories. incredible stories that really had long-lasting effect if you took time to listen to them. But most people, like I said, missed out on that.
Well, really interesting conversation as far as I'm concerned. I thoroughly enjoyed that. So I want to thank both Mark and Sean for joining me in on this little escapade through some very interesting musical catalogs. And I want to thank all of you for your continued support. You can always send us your feedback at via email at acetalksmusic@gmail.com, or you can leave comments right in the comments section on whatever platform that you're watching or listening to this on. You may also want to come and join us on the patreon.com platform, where we run our after hours show, where we talk a little bit about some things that we don't talk about on the main show. But in the meantime, enjoy yourself and be careful. I know that shows are starting to open up slowly and surely, but there's still danger out there. So please take care of yourself and stay safe.